The year was 1933. Japan stood at a crossroads, caught between a proud past and a turbulent future. The Great Depression had shaken its economy, leaving thousands of families in poverty. Hunger gnawed at villages, shadows spread through the cities, and the empire's militarist ambitions began to eclipse the quiet traditions of rural life. In the alleys and temples of Tokyo and beyond, whispers traveled about strange sects, radical brotherhoods, and cults that thrived in secrecy. But among these, one story would later surface that seemed too horrific, too blasphemous, too unnatural to believe. It was the tale of a cult that did not simply pray, chant, or sacrifice. It was the tale of a cult that worshipped cannibalism. Human flesh has always been the ultimate taboo. Across cultures, across centuries, the act of consuming another person's body is treated as a line that should never be crossed. Yet in times of desperation, history has recorded instances when that line is shattered. Famines, shipwrecks, sieges, moments when survival eclipsed morality. But what made this Japanese cult so uniquely disturbing was that cannibalism was not a last resort, not a consequence of starvation. It was devotion. It was ritual. It was faith. Members believed that by consuming flesh, they communed with powers greater than themselves, transcending mortality and binding their souls together in an eternal covenant of blood. This is not the Japan of cherry blossoms and tea ceremonies, nor the image of samurai honor so often romanticized. This is a hidden Japan, one that existed in the shadows of economic collapse and political unrest. The world outside was changing at a rapid pace: industrial progress, rising nationalism, and a creeping militarism that prepared the nation for war. But inside darkened rooms, lit only by flickering candles and the smell of incense masking something far more sinister, rituals unfolded that blurred the line between religion and nightmare. Those who entered rarely spoke again, and those who did carried stories so grotesque they were dismissed as delusions or madness. Yet the evidence, bones, testimonies, fragments of suppressed trial records, suggest something far darker than myth. To understand why such a cult could exist, one must first step into the atmosphere of Japan in 1933. Famine haunted the northern regions, with rice shortages forcing families to desperate measures. Rural superstitions blended with fractured interpretations of Shinto purity, creating a fertile ground for charismatic leaders who claimed to hold answers in times of uncertainty. In Tokyo, secret societies had already begun to rise, some ultranationalist, some apocalyptic, some promising power through strange rites. Within this climate of desperation, belief, and secrecy, the cult was born. Its founder was a man who preached that the consumption of flesh was not merely survival but spiritual elevation, a way to strip away weakness and to ingest divine essence. To his followers, what others saw as abomination became salvation. The story we are about to unravel is not easy to hear. It forces us to question the fragility of morality and the depths of human belief. What could drive ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, young students, to accept the unthinkable as holy? Was it desperation? Was it brainwashing? Or was it something deeper, a reflection of humanity's darkest hunger hiding beneath the surface of every culture? By examining the case of this Japanese cult, we confront not only their horror but also the uncomfortable truth that the boundary between faith and madness is thinner than we like to believe. There are no heroes in this story, only victims and perpetrators, and sometimes the line between them blurs until you cannot tell who is who. The recruits who entered the cult often did so searching for belonging, guidance, or escape from poverty. Many did not realize until it was too late that they had stepped into something that would demand from them the ultimate price. Once inside, the oaths they swore bound them in silence and fear. To leave was to betray, and betrayal meant death, or worse, being offered as the next feast. Those who survived the initiation became complicit, whether willingly or by force. The rituals broke them down, reshaping their identities until the act of consuming flesh no longer seemed monstrous but divine. It was a slow corrosion of the soul, carried out in the name of salvation. The Japanese authorities of the time were not blind to strange sects. They kept tabs on nationalist societies, religious movements, and political dissidents. Yet this cult was not immediately known. It lived in the margins, preying on those least likely to be noticed: runaways, the impoverished, the forgotten. For years, it existed in whispers, too unbelievable to be considered a true threat. It was only when disappearances mounted, when strange remains were discovered, that the horror began to surface. Even then, much of what was discovered was quickly buried, suppressed to protect Japan's national image during a delicate political moment. To admit that a cult of cannibals had thrived in its society was unthinkable for the government. But silence does not erase truth. Silence only ensures that the truth festers, waiting to be uncovered decades later. What you are about to hear is drawn from fragments, archival records, suppressed articles, and survivor testimonies. Some of it sounds like folklore, some of it like nightmare, but all of it points to a chilling reality. In 1933, in the heart of Japan, there existed a cult that worshipped through the act of eating human flesh. And their story is not just about horror. It is about what happens when belief, desperation, and secrecy merge into something monstrous. By the end of this journey, you will not only understand the cult's origins, rituals, and downfall, but you will be forced to face the question that lingers long after the facts are laid bare. If faith can sanctify even the unthinkable, then how safe are any of us from the darkness within? Japan in 1933 was a nation caught between centuries. To the outside world, it was a country racing toward modernity, its factories running day and night, its army preparing for war, and its politicians shaping an empire that sought to dominate Asia. But beneath this polished surface, the realities for ordinary citizens were far more bleak. The Great Depression had carved deep scars into the nation's economy. Families in rural villages struggled to afford rice, their most basic staple. Children went hungry, parents took on desperate work, and many lived in fear of starvation. The promise of industrial progress seemed distant, unreachable, as the shadows of poverty crept across the land. For the poor, the state's ambitions meant little. They were left to fend for themselves in a society that was changing faster than they could understand. It was in this crucible of suffering that strange beliefs began to take hold. Japan had long been a country where religion was layered and complex. Shinto and Buddhism formed the backbone of spiritual life, but folk traditions, ancestor worship, and rural superstitions often intertwined. In the 1930s, however, a new force began to infiltrate this spiritual landscape: secret societies. Some were driven by nationalism, pledging loyalty to the emperor above all else. Others promised mystical power, hidden knowledge, or salvation from suffering. At a time when the state demanded conformity and obedience, these underground movements offered an alternative, a sense of belonging for those who felt abandoned by the system. The government itself was walking a dangerous line. Militarism was rising, and Japan's ambitions in Manchuria demanded total control at home. Nationalists preached about purity, loyalty, and sacrifice for the empire. Ordinary citizens were taught that suffering was noble, that hunger was a test of devotion, and that death in service of the nation was the highest honor. Yet while propaganda celebrated strength, the reality for many was weakness. This contradiction created a psychological rift, one that cult leaders and radical thinkers could exploit. The hunger of 1933 was not just for food. It was a hunger for answers, for hope, for escape from the relentless grind of poverty. When a charismatic voice promised meaning in suffering, people listened. When a leader claimed to possess rituals that could transform weakness into strength, followers gathered. It was in this cultural and social environment that the seeds of the cannibalism cult were planted. And though most Japanese people clung to tradition, there were those on the fringes who were drawn to darker paths. In Tokyo, the capital, whispers of secret meetings circulated. The city was growing at a staggering rate, but its backstreets remained crowded with beggars, orphans, and drifters. These people were invisible to polite society, yet they were the most vulnerable to radical recruitment. In the northern provinces, famine struck harder, forcing families into unimaginable choices. It is said that in some rural areas, tales of eating human flesh in times of desperation resurfaced, old folk horror stories that were once only whispered around the fire. These stories merged with new, dangerous ideologies, giving birth to something unique: the idea that consuming flesh was not only acceptable but sacred. This was not an isolated phenomenon. Across the world during times of economic despair, fringe groups often rise. In Europe, fascism was gathering strength. In America, cults and revivalist movements offered salvation from economic ruin. Japan's version was darker, shaped by its own traditions of purity, sacrifice, and the emperor's divine authority. Cannibalism, unthinkable in public life, became twisted into a form of spiritual nationalism in the hands of radicals. If the nation demanded sacrifice, then the cult demanded it in the most literal sense. The newspapers of the time rarely reported on such movements. Japan's press was tightly controlled, and stories that might bring shame to the empire were swiftly silenced. What the public read was carefully curated: stories of industrial triumph, of soldiers conquering abroad, of a nation marching proudly into the future. But beneath these headlines, the real stories lingered in the shadows. Missing persons notices filled local papers. Families whispered about daughters who never came home, sons who fell in with strange groups and were never seen again. In the countryside, rumors of dark feasts spread, carried by those who claimed to have seen the aftermath of secret rituals. Fear was a powerful weapon in 1933. Citizens feared the police, feared the army, feared betraying the emperor's image of unity. But beneath these fears was another, older one, the fear of hunger. And hunger makes people vulnerable. In this atmosphere, the cannibalism cult could grow, hidden by silence, protected by secrecy, and fed by desperation. The authorities were not entirely ignorant. Japan's Special Higher Police, the TOC, were tasked with monitoring subversive groups, from communists to cults. But their focus was political dissent, not fringe religious practices. Unless a sect threatened the state directly, it was often ignored. And so, while Japan prepared for war abroad, the war within its own people, the war of hunger, faith, and desperation, was left to fester. The cult that emerged in 1933 was more than just a religious aberration. It was a reflection of its time. A nation that preached purity and strength produced a sect that sought purity through the consumption of flesh. A society that demanded sacrifice found its mirror in rituals of blood. And a people abandoned by their leaders sought salvation in the darkest of places. To understand this cult is to understand the shadows of Japan itself in that era. It was not an accident, not a bizarre anomaly detached from reality. It was the inevitable outcome of a society strained to breaking point, where hunger and fear could be reshaped into belief, and where belief could justify the unthinkable. As the year 1933 unfolded, few could imagine that in the quiet corners of their own cities and villages, rituals were taking place that turned neighbors into prey and faith into horror. Yet that was the world in which the cult took root. And as its founder gathered followers, as rituals became more elaborate, and as belief grew stronger, the line between desperation and devotion would vanish. What remained was the cult's gospel of flesh. Every cult begins with a voice. A single figure who dares to say aloud what others only whisper in the dark. In the case of Japan's cannibal cult of 1933, that voice belonged to a man whose name has nearly been erased from official records, surviving only in fragments, suggesting both the shame his existence brought and the power he once wielded. He was not a samurai, not a monk, not even a scholar. He was a drifter who had lived too long in hunger and too long in shadows. To his followers, he became something more than human. To the authorities, he was a contagion that spread madness through belief. His beginnings were ordinary, perhaps even pitiable. Born into poverty in the northern regions of Japan, he grew up in an era when food was scarce and survival often meant sacrifice. The tales of his childhood, if they can be trusted, speak of famine years when villagers whispered of eating the flesh of the dead to survive. He carried these stories into adulthood, where they transformed from desperate folklore into something he began to call sacred truth. By the time he reached Tokyo in the early 1930s, he had crafted a new identity, not as a beggar or wanderer, but as a prophet. Charisma is a dangerous weapon in the hands of the desperate. Those who met him spoke of his ability to command a room with little more than a whisper. He did not shout like other preachers. He spoke softly, almost tenderly, weaving words of salvation that promised his followers relief from suffering. But beneath this gentleness was something darker, a conviction that pain, hunger, and even death were not to be avoided but embraced. He told them that the human body was not merely flesh, it was a vessel of power, a sacred host of divine energy. And to consume it was to consume divinity itself. The doctrine was simple in its horror. Where others saw starvation, he saw ritual purification. Where others saw shame, he saw transcendence. He taught that by eating the flesh of another, one could ingest their strength, their spirit, their purity. In a society obsessed with the idea of purity, racial, spiritual, and moral, his message resonated with those who felt corrupted by poverty and weakness. To be poor was to be impure. To be powerless was to be tainted. But through ritual, through sacrifice, through flesh, they could be cleansed. He began with small gatherings. At first, his followers were little more than lost souls, drifters, outcasts, and young men estranged from their families. But he offered them something they craved above all, belonging. In the backrooms of rented houses, in candlelit chambers far from the eyes of authorities, he began to craft the cult's rituals. The earliest initiations did not involve flesh. They were symbolic acts of devotion, oaths written in blood, offerings of animal sacrifices, fasting to the brink of collapse. But slowly, Almost imperceptibly, he led them further. The moment of transition came when he invoked an ancient tale, one his followers claimed had been passed down through their villages for generations, the story of the famine feast. In times of starvation, when all crops failed, villagers were said to have drawn lots. The unlucky chosen would be sacrificed so the others could survive. To eat of the body was not betrayal, but devotion, a gift to ensure the community's survival. He twisted this folklore into doctrine, preaching that they were not merely recreating survival rituals of the past, but perfecting them. What had once been desperation was now enlightenment. Soon, flesh appeared on the altar. At first, it was said to be stolen from morgues or purchased from corrupt attendants who looked the other way. These early acts blurred the line between scavenging and ritual. But in time, the boundaries dissolved entirely. Followers were told that true devotion required fresh sacrifice. To taste sanctified flesh was to transcend humanity itself. And so the cult was reborn, no longer a gathering of outcasts, but a sect defined by its willingness to consume what the world declared forbidden. The founder's charisma grew with each ritual. His sermons became darker, yet his voice remained calm, convincing, almost soothing. He told them that the outside world was rotting, that Japan's leaders had abandoned its people, that only through flesh could they restore purity to their souls. In an age where the state preached purity of race and sacrifice for the nation, his words carried a dangerous echo. He turned national rhetoric inward, twisting it until loyalty was no longer owed to emperor or country, but to him and his rituals. As membership grew, so did the secrecy. Initiates were sworn into silence through oaths sealed with blood and threats of violent punishment. They created symbols, hidden marks scrawled on walls or carved into wooden talismans, identifying safe meeting places. Outsiders were forbidden from witnessing the rituals, and those who strayed too close disappeared. To the authorities, the cult remained invisible, just another of the many underground sects in Tokyo's underbelly. To the families of the missing, it became a phantom story, a nightmare whispered in alleys and rural towns. The cult's growth was fueled by desperation. Some joined willingly, convinced by the founder's promises of salvation. Others were drawn in by hunger, offered meals when no one else would feed them. A bowl of rice could be enough to capture loyalty in 1933. Once inside, they found themselves trapped in a cycle of dependence and fear. To leave was to betray, and betrayal carried the ultimate penalty. In this way, the founder crafted not only a religion but a prison, one built not of walls but of belief. What made this cult particularly insidious was the way it blurred the boundaries between tradition and heresy. In Japanese folklore, purity rituals often involved symbolic consumption. Rice shared with the dead, sake poured as an offering. He twisted these into justifications for his practices, claiming that eating flesh was no different from consuming sacred food in a shrine. By cloaking horror in the language of faith, he made it palatable, even holy. It is difficult to say how many were drawn into his circle by 1933. Some records suggest only a few dozen, others hint at hundreds scattered across rural and urban Japan. But what is clear is that his movement had spread far enough to draw notice, far enough to leave behind bodies, and far enough to terrify those who dared to speak of it. The founder himself remained an elusive figure. Some describe him as gaunt, his eyes burning with feverish light. Others said he was unremarkable, his plainness making his charisma all the more unsettling. Whatever the truth, he was the spark that lit the fire. And once the fire was lit, it could not be contained. The cult had moved beyond whispers and into the realm of blood. Flesh was no longer desperation, it was devotion. And in that devotion, the line between faith and monstrosity dissolved forever. Initiation into the cult was not a matter of simple agreement. One did not merely join, one surrendered. To cross the threshold from outsider to initiate was to abandon not just family, identity, or honor, but humanity itself. The founder knew that to truly bind his followers, he had to create rituals so terrifying, so irreversible, that once performed, there could be no turning back. He designed them with precision, each step crafted to strip away resistance and replace it with loyalty. The ceremonies began at night, always in secret, always away from the curious eyes of neighbors or authorities. The locations varied: abandoned shrines, deserted warehouses, candlelit rooms in the back alleys of Tokyo, or hidden clearings in rural woods. Followers arrived in silence, their faces covered by cloths, each carrying offerings of rice, coins, or sometimes blood drawn from their own arms. At the center of the gathering stood the altar. Sometimes it was nothing more than a crude wooden table, at other times a stone slab smeared with old stains. Upon it rested the symbols of their devotion, incense burning thick in the air, bowls of salt water to purify, and, always, a covered vessel that hinted at the ritual's final horror. Before an initiate could be accepted, they underwent fasting. Days of hunger left them weakened, their minds clouded, their bodies trembling. The founder insisted this suffering was necessary. Hunger stripped away illusions, making the soul receptive to new truth. In those weakened states, the words of the cult carried more weight than reason. By the time the initiate entered the ritual chamber, they were already half broken, they were softened by desperation. The first stage was the oath. Kneeling before the founder, the initiate was commanded to cut their palm and let the blood fall onto the altar. They swore not only silence but devotion, vowing that should they betray the cult, their flesh would be consumed as punishment. This oath was not symbolic. The founder would lean close, his voice soft and calm, reminding them that every person in the room had already made the same vow. To betray was to die, and to die was to feed. Fear sealed their loyalty. The second stage was the ritual of the vessel. The covered bowl was unveiled, revealing flesh. In the earliest ceremonies, it was said to be taken from cadavers, stolen limbs or fragments hidden from authorities. Later, as the cult grew bolder, the offerings were fresher. The initiate was told that to consume the flesh was to complete their rebirth, to shed their former life and become one with the cult. The act was slow, deliberate. They were made to chew in silence as others chanted around them, their voices rising and falling in hypnotic cadence. What might have been nauseating or revolting in another context became unavoidable under the weight of expectation, hunger, and fear. But the rituals did not stop at a single act of consumption. Over time, initiates were forced deeper into ceremonies that blurred the line between sacrifice and devotion. Some nights, they were ordered to carve the flesh themselves, their trembling hands guided by older members. On others, they were required to share bowls with strangers, the mingling of blood and saliva framed as sacred communion. Each ritual erased more of their former identity, binding them to the group through shared guilt, shared horror, and shared secrecy. The cult developed a hierarchy, with initiates climbing through stages marked by increasingly severe rites. The lowest rank involved symbolic acts, cutting themselves, fasting, consuming scraps of preserved flesh. The higher ranks demanded blood offerings, participation in abductions, and direct involvement in ritual feasts. To reach the inner circle was to surrender completely, not only consuming but providing flesh. It was whispered that some offered small pieces of their own bodies, fingers, skin, or muscle, as proof of loyalty. These gruesome acts were rewarded with status and trust, elevating them above the trembling newcomers. The founder justified these horrors with doctrine. He told them that flesh was the purest sacrament, that by eating it, they consumed not just strength but the essence of devotion. To eat together was to bind their souls eternally, to forge a brotherhood stronger than any law, family, or nation. He compared it to the sacred meals of ancient religions, twisting familiar concepts into grotesque parodies. Where Christians spoke of bread as the body of Christ, he presented actual flesh as the body of purity. Where Shinto rites used symbolic offerings of food to the gods, he offered the gods themselves in human form. The line between metaphor and reality was obliterated. Witnesses who later spoke of these rituals described them with trembling voices. The air thick with incense and smoke. The sound of chanting, rhythmic and endless, drowning out thought. The sight of pale faces illuminated by candlelight, their eyes glazed with hunger and devotion. And, at the center, the act itself, the passing of bowls, the slow chewing, the silence broken only by whispers of prayer. To outsiders, it would have been a scene of nightmare. To the cult, it was holy. Not every initiate accepted their fate willingly. Some tried to flee after their first ritual, their minds recoiling from what they had done. But the cult was relentless. Those who left were hunted, threatened, and sometimes killed. Their bodies became offerings, consumed as proof of the founder's warning. The message was clear. To enter was to cross a threshold from which there was no return. The ritual was not just an initiation, it was a trap. As the cult expanded, so too did the elaboration of its ceremonies. In rural settings, they performed under the moon, their chants echoing into the night while villagers whispered of strange lights in the forests. In urban hideouts, they concealed their feasts with noise, laughter, and music, disguising horror as celebration. Wherever they gathered, they left behind traces, bones buried hastily, stains on floors, rumors carried by terrified neighbors. Yet the secrecy was maintained through fear and silence, the rituals binding them tighter than any chain. The initiations ensured loyalty, but they also created a shared identity. Every member, from the lowest initiate to the inner circle, carried the same stain, the same guilt, the same unthinkable memory. In that guilt lay control. To leave would be to reveal their crime, to face not only the cult's wrath but society's rejection. To stay was to find belonging, no matter how grotesque. And so they stayed. By 1933, the cult had perfected its machinery of initiation. The rituals were no longer mere acts of horror but carefully constructed performances of faith, discipline, and loyalty. Each new initiate added to the group's strength, while each ritual reinforced the founder's control. Flesh was no longer simply food. It was covenant, communion, and curse. The deeper one entered, the harder it became to imagine a world outside. The cult's members were no longer sons, daughters, or neighbors. They were bound in blood, remade through ritual, transformed into worshippers of the unthinkable. And as the initiations multiplied, the cult's hunger grew, not just for flesh, but for power, secrecy, and survival. Every cult builds itself on victims, and this one was no exception. The most terrifying truth about the cannibal cult of 1933 was not simply that they consumed flesh. It was that the line between follower and victim blurred until one could hardly tell where loyalty ended and sacrifice began. Inside the cult's walls, no one was safe. Every member was both predator and prey, bound by fear, devotion, and the knowledge that at any moment, they might be chosen to become the next offering. At first, the victims came from outside. The cult preyed on the invisible people of Japan's streets, orphans, vagrants, the impoverished who wandered Tokyo's alleys with no family to protect them and no one to report their disappearance. These people were lured in with promises of food, shelter, or purpose. For a starving child, a bowl of rice offered by a stranger could feel like salvation. For a lonely drifter, the warmth of a group could replace years of isolation. But once inside, the truth revealed itself too late. Those who resisted became sacrifices, their absence unnoticed by a society already drowning in poverty. But the founder's genius, and his cruelty, was in turning the cult inward. He taught that true purity required sacrifice not just of outsiders but of their own. It was a test of loyalty. To watch a stranger die was one thing. To offer a brother, a sister, or even oneself was another. In this way, victims were no longer just outsiders. They were members themselves, reshaped into offerings in the name of devotion. The cult's hierarchy enforced this system. At the bottom were the initiates, those still trembling from their first ritual, their loyalty fragile but sealed by fear. They were most vulnerable to becoming victims. Higher members watched them closely, judging every action, every hesitation. A misplaced glance, a whispered doubt, even a delay in chanting during a ritual could mark them as weak. And weakness, the founder insisted, was impurity. Impurity demanded cleansing. Cleansing meant flesh. There are accounts, fragmented, half-buried in court documents and whispered testimony, that describe these selections. A young man accused of cowardice during a ceremony was beaten by the group, bound, and presented as an offering. A woman who tried to flee was captured and dragged back, her punishment not death by exile but death by ritual. In these moments, the cult revealed its most insidious truth. Victims were not chosen by fate but created by the group itself. Every member lived under constant judgment, knowing that to falter was to feed the altar. Not all victims were unwilling. Some, broken by devotion, offered themselves freely. Testimonies suggest that the founder preached of ultimate purity, the idea that to give one's own flesh was the highest act of faith. A few followers, consumed by this twisted theology, volunteered small parts of themselves. A slice of skin, a finger, a piece of muscle carved while still alive. These acts horrified even some within the cult, but they also reinforced the founder's control. If one person could sacrifice willingly, what excuse did the rest have for fear? The voluntary victims became martyrs, and their suffering silenced dissent. Yet behind the rhetoric of devotion lay a much darker reality: coercion. Many who volunteered did so under unbearable pressure, convinced that refusal would mean greater suffering or immediate execution. The founder's manipulation was subtle but effective, turning desperation into apparent loyalty, disguising fear as faith. Victims often smiled through their agony, chanting as they bled, while others looked on in silence, knowing that tomorrow it might be their turn. The cult's obsession with sacrifice created a cycle of terror. Members lived in a constant state of tension, never knowing when suspicion might fall on them. Sleep was uneasy, conversations cautious. Every ritual became a gamble. Would they emerge as worshippers, or would they be dragged to the altar? This atmosphere of paranoia ensured obedience. To question the founder was unthinkable, to resist impossible. The rituals of sacrifice had broken them all. Outsiders continued to vanish as well. Farmers reported missing laboris, city families filed police reports for children who never returned, but most cases faded without resolution. The cult thrived on this silence. Japan's fractured society provided cover. The homeless had no voices, the poor had no advocates, and the state cared little for those at the bottom. In this way, victims were erased twice, once by death, and again by indifference. The victims within the cult became its most powerful tool. Their suffering cemented the loyalty of others, binding the group together through shared guilt and shared horror. To have eaten the flesh of a brother or sister was to carry a stain that could never be washed away. This guilt tethered members to the cult, for how could they ever return to ordinary life after such acts? Who would accept them if the truth were known? The founder understood this perfectly. Each victim not only fed the cult's rituals but also deepened its prison. There is a chilling paradox at the heart of the story. The cult's members were both perpetrators and victims, both complicit and trapped. They devoured, and they feared being devoured. They inflicted suffering, and they dreaded their own turn. In this endless cycle, humanity dissolved. What remained was a community of broken souls, bound together not by love or hope, but by fear, secrecy, and flesh. Looking back, it is easy to view them as monsters. Yet to do so risks ignoring the truth that many of them were once ordinary people. Children of farmers, students, laboris, people who, in another world, might have lived quiet lives. Instead, caught in the despair of 1933, they were drawn into something that turned them into both cannibals and sacrificers. The victims within remind us that the cult was not simply an outside threat, but a corruption of humanity itself. By the time the authorities began to take notice, countless victims had already been consumed, their names lost, their faces forgotten. The cult carried on, feeding its hunger in silence, its victims erased by secrecy. To this day, we cannot know how many lives were swallowed by its rituals. But we do know this: the cult's victims were not merely eaten. They were transformed into symbols of obedience, martyrs to a grotesque faith that thrived on turning humans into offerings. To outsiders, the cult's rituals seemed like madness. To consume human flesh was an act of desperation at best, a crime at worst. But to the followers within, the act was far from barbaric, it was holy. The founder's greatest achievement was not in organizing ceremonies or hiding from the authorities. It was in convincing his followers that cannibalism was faith, that their consumption was not a crime but a sacred right. This transformation of horror into holiness was the cornerstone of the cult, and it explains why men and women continued to obey even when faced with the unthinkable. The doctrine was built upon a twisted reinterpretation of spiritual ideas already embedded in Japanese culture. Shinto emphasized purity, ritual cleanliness, separation from death, and reverence for sacred forces. Buddhism spoke of transcendence, of freeing oneself from the cycle of suffering and rebirth. The founder wove these traditions into his sermons, but distorted them until they no longer resembled their origins. He told his followers that purity was not achieved through avoidance of corruption, but through consuming it. To eat flesh, he said, was to devour impurity itself, to cleanse it through one's body, and in doing so, to rise closer to the divine. He spoke of flesh as if it were a sacred text. Each bite carried meaning, each meal was a prayer. Where others saw sin, he saw salvation. When you eat, he whispered to them, you do not consume death, you consume life. You take their strength into you, you bind your soul to theirs, you rise above weakness. His sermons blurred the boundaries of morality, convincing his listeners that what the world called abhorrent was in fact the truest expression of devotion. Cannibalism was not framed as desperation, but as choice. This distinction was crucial. The founder taught that animals were base creatures, incapable of containing divine essence. Only humans, touched by spirit, carried the purity worth consuming. To eat flesh was not a matter of survival, it was communion with the sacred. The act became sacrament, comparable to the Christian Eucharist or the Shinto offerings of rice and sake. Where others consumed symbols, the cult consumed reality. They believed themselves closer to truth because they did not pretend. The rituals reflected this ideology. The sharing of flesh was not chaotic but carefully structured. Each participant received a portion, no more, no less, echoing the distribution of offerings in traditional ceremonies. They bowed before eating, whispered prayers as they chewed, and often fasted beforehand to prepare their bodies as vessels of purity. These were not acts of madness but acts of devotion, carried out with solemnity and reverence. To an outsider, the scene was grotesque. To them, it was worship. Over time, the founder expanded the theology. Flesh was not merely food, it was medicine. He claimed it cured weakness, healed the spirit, and could even prolong life. The sick were urged to consume in order to recover. The weak were told it would give them strength. Some accounts suggest that fragments of flesh were dried and preserved, distributed as talismans to ward off misfortune. In this way, cannibalism became more than ritual. It became daily life, an ongoing faith that extended beyond the altar. To cement the doctrine, the founder wove nationalistic rhetoric into his sermons. Japan in 1933 was a nation obsessed with purity and sacrifice for the emperor. The cult mirrored this by teaching that their consumption was itself an act of patriotism. By purifying themselves through flesh, they were preparing their souls to serve the empire more fully. In their twisted view, they were not rebels but the truest patriots, embodying sacrifice in the most literal sense. This blending of nationalism and faith gave the cult a dangerous edge. They were not simply heretics, they believed themselves guardians of a higher Japan. The theology also justified violence. If flesh was sacred, then killing was not murder but consecration. Victims were framed as offerings, their deaths sanctified by ritual. To resist was not only futile but blasphemous. In this way, the cult erased guilt. Members who might otherwise recoil at violence were convinced that they were not killing but elevating. Their victims were promised transcendence through sacrifice, transformed from ordinary humans into sacred vessels. The act of eating them was presented as a form of honor, not desecration. The power of this belief cannot be overstated. History has shown that faith, when distorted, can justify the unthinkable. Crusades, inquisitions, sacrifices, all have been carried out under the banner of the sacred. The cult of 1933 followed the same path, cloaking atrocity in the language of holiness. And for those trapped inside, the doctrine was a shield against doubt. To question the practice would be to question faith itself, and faith was the only thing they had left. Some testimonies suggest that not all members were convinced. There were whispers of hesitation, of initiates who gagged as they chewed, who trembled during rituals. But the group dynamic crushed resistance. Surrounded by chanting voices, bound by oaths of blood, weakened by fasting, few had the strength to resist. Those who faltered became victims, reinforcing the doctrine by their very deaths. In this way, doubt was not eradicated, it was consumed. The belief in flesh as faith gave the cult endurance. It was not merely a grotesque practice hidden in the shadows. It was a system of meaning that sustained itself, binding members to one another and to their leader. Through this theology, the cult survived longer than hunger or madness alone could have sustained it. It gave structure to chaos, purpose to horror. And in doing so, it ensured that the cult was not a passing aberration but a lasting threat. To the outside world, cannibalism was a crime. To the cult, it was communion. This chasm of understanding made it almost impossible for authorities to comprehend the depth of the movement. When the first whispers reached the ears of police and journalists, they assumed desperation, starvation, madness. They did not yet grasp that for the cult, flesh was not food, it was faith, and faith is far harder to destroy than hunger. For years, the cult existed like a shadow, seen only in fragments, whispered of but never fully grasped. It thrived in the blind spots of society, preying on the forgotten and hiding behind rituals so unthinkable that those who heard the rumors dismissed them as nightmares or folk tales. But shadows do not stay hidden forever. By 1933, the whispers had grown too loud to ignore, and the cult's existence began to bleed into the consciousness of the outside world. Discovery did not come all at once. It was pieced together like a crime scene, fragments of horror slowly coalescing into a picture too dark to deny. The first cracks appeared in the form of disappearances. In rural villages, families reported missing sons and daughters who had gone to Tokyo to find work and never returned. At first, their absence was explained away as migration or abandonment. The Depression had forced many to leave home, and it was common for young men to vanish into the labyrinth of the city, sending neither word nor coin back to their families. But as the numbers grew, and as entire groups of travelers failed to reappear, questions began to surface. In Tokyo itself, the poor and homeless were vanishing at an alarming rate. Police dismissed these cases as inevitable. Life in the city was dangerous, and those without family ties were often swallowed by crime, disease, or despair. But neighbors noticed more. They spoke of strangers recruiting in alleyways, of gaunt men promising food and shelter to the hungry. Some claimed to have seen processions at night, small groups moving through backstreets with covered bundles, chanting softly as they walked. The police called it paranoia. But fear was spreading. Then came the remains. In abandoned lots, scavengers found bones buried shallowly in the dirt, gnawed as if by animals but broken in ways no beast would manage. Farmers stumbled upon pits in the forests, where charred fragments of human remains mixed with ash and stone. These discoveries were reported quietly, often dismissed by local officials as accidents or the work of wild dogs. But some records, hidden in police files and only resurfacing years later, described the undeniable signs of human butchery. The whispers of cannibalism had found their first physical proof. Journalists played a crucial role in bringing these rumors into the open. Japan's press in 1933 was tightly controlled, but smaller local papers sometimes slipped stories past the censors. One such report described the disappearance of 3 young women in Tokyo, hinting at a strange sect that lured them with promises of spiritual cleansing. Another paper carried an anonymous column warning of a cult that feasts in secret upon the bodies of the lost. These articles were quickly pulled, their editors reprimanded, but the damage was done. The stories had been printed, and once printed, they could not be erased entirely. It was not only the press that noticed. Police records from the Special Higher Police, the TOC, mentioned surveillance of radical spiritual groups in Tokyo during this period. Most attention was aimed at leftist movements or ultranationalist sects, but occasionally a line surfaces about a group involved in obscene rituals. The cult, it seems, had brushed against the edges of official awareness. But because it posed no direct political threat to the empire, it was not treated as a priority. This neglect allowed it to continue in the shadows, even as evidence mounted. The turning point came when whispers reached families of influence. One account tells of a young university student from a respected Tokyo family who vanished after falling in with a strange group. When his mutilated remains were eventually discovered in a forest outside the city, the case could no longer be ignored. His family demanded answers, pressing officials to act. Suddenly, what had been dismissed as superstition or rumor became a matter of national embarrassment. The cult's existence had brushed against the respectable classes, and the state could not risk the shame. As investigations began, more disturbing details emerged. Witnesses, neighbors, estranged members, terrified villagers began to speak, cautiously, often anonymously. They described gatherings in abandoned shrines, of nights filled with chanting and the smell of burning flesh. They spoke of missing persons being lured into secret houses, never to return. Some even claimed to have seen the rituals themselves, though their stories were so grotesque that officials questioned their sanity. One woman described hearing screams from the forest near her home, followed by the sound of drums and laughter. Another man swore he saw a procession carrying a bound figure beneath the cover of night. Whether every story was true or not hardly mattered. Together they created a tapestry of fear. The public began to whisper openly. Rumors spread in markets and tea houses. Mothers warned their children not to wander after dark. Laborists traveling to the city carried charms for protection, muttering prayers as they passed unfamiliar faces. Even those who did not believe in the stories felt their weight. The idea of a cannibal cult hiding in their midst, feeding on the poor and forgotten, was too disturbing to dismiss completely. The authorities found themselves in a difficult position. To acknowledge the cult was to admit that such depravity could exist within the empire, tarnishing Japan's carefully crafted image of purity and order. Yet to ignore it was to risk greater scandal if the stories grew louder. Their response was cautious, slow, and often contradictory. Officially, there was silence. Unofficially, investigations began to circle closer, quietly gathering intelligence, infiltrating meetings, and following the trails of missing persons. For the cult itself, discovery was both a threat and a test of faith. The founder assured his followers that the outside world would never understand their holiness, that persecution was inevitable for those who held truth. In his sermons, he reframed exposure as prophecy. The purer they became, the more the corrupt world would seek to destroy them. This narrative only deepened the loyalty of many members, convincing them that discovery was not a sign of weakness but of their righteousness. Yet cracks had formed. Fear spread within as well as without. Some members began to doubt, whispering of escape. A few fled, leaving behind fragments of testimony that would later aid investigators. The cult was no longer invisible. Its existence was known, its secrets leaking into the streets, its rituals now a matter of investigation. The age of shadows was ending, and with it came the first glimmers of exposure. By late 1933, what had begun as rumors and disappearances had become undeniable. Bones had been unearthed. Families demanded justice. Journalists risked censure to print what they knew. The police had infiltrated enough to understand that this was no ordinary sect. And while much of what followed would be suppressed, erased from the public record, the discovery had already begun. The cult could no longer hide. Its secrecy was unraveling, its rituals now on the verge of being dragged into the light. Once the cult's existence could no longer be contained within rumor, the machinery of the state finally turned its gaze upon it. What had been whispered in alleys and printed in half-erased newspaper columns now became a matter for the police. The Special Hire Police, already tasked with rooting out subversive groups and dissent, began to treat the cult as more than a curiosity. It was now a potential scandal, a story that, if left unchecked, could stain Japan's image of purity and order. What followed was an investigation as methodical as it was horrifying, peeling back the layers of secrecy to reveal the grotesque truth at the heart of the sect. The first step was surveillance. Investigators quietly infiltrated neighborhoods where disappearances had occurred, interviewing landlords, neighbors, and shopkeepers. They heard the same things repeated in different words: strange gatherings late at night, the smell of smoke and incense, and groups of thin, pale figures moving in silence. One witness claimed to have seen blood-stained cloths being carried from a house at dawn. Another recalled hearing chanting that grew louder until it cut off abruptly, followed by silence broken only by footsteps in the street. The stories varied in detail but not in tone. They all spoke of something abnormal, something unsettling. Police began to identify key meeting places. In Tokyo, they marked abandoned shrines where offerings of burned bones had been found. In rural areas, they tracked reports of fires in the woods, the ground around them scarred by ritual circles. What struck investigators most was the consistency. Wherever the cult had been, there were remnants of ceremony. The cult's secrecy was formidable, but their rituals left physical scars on the landscape, scars that no amount of ash or dirt could conceal. Raids soon followed. The first came quietly, in the dead of night, targeting a suspected meeting house in the outskirts of Tokyo. What police found inside was enough to confirm the darkest rumors. Candles burned down to their stubs still clung to the floor. Bowls caked with dried blood sat stacked against the walls. And in the center of the room, upon a crude wooden altar, investigators discovered fragments of bone, some charred, some fresh, some with unmistakable marks of cutting and carving. The air itself stank of death, stale and clinging, as if the walls had absorbed the memory of suffering. The discoveries multiplied with each raid. In a rural village, a hidden cellar revealed jars of preserved flesh, floating in brine like grotesque trophies. In another location, police uncovered burial pits, shallow and hurriedly covered, where limbs and torsos mingled with ashen stones. The bodies bore signs not only of death but of deliberate mutilation, sections removed with precision, as though consumed systematically. Even seasoned investigators recoiled at the sight. The evidence was undeniable. But evidence alone was not enough. The police needed confessions. Interrogations began, and here the true horror of the cult spilled forth. At first, members resisted, bound by oaths of silence and fear of retribution. But starvation, isolation, and pressure broke them down. Piece by piece, testimonies emerged, each confirming and expanding upon the others. They spoke of initiations sealed by blood, of meals shared in whispers, of sacrifices chosen from within their own ranks. They named the founder as the prophet of flesh, the one who declared that eating was holiness and killing was purity. What horrified investigators most was the calmness with which some members spoke. They did not describe their actions as crimes but as duties. One man, trembling, insisted that he had not killed but released his victim, sending them to a higher plane through ritual. Another woman claimed that eating flesh had cured her illness, that she felt stronger, cleaner, more alive than before. The confessions blurred the line between insanity and devotion, forcing the police to confront the fact that this was not merely criminality but belief so strong it had remade morality itself. The founder's capture proved more difficult. For weeks he evaded police, moving from safe house to safe house, protected by loyal followers who saw his persecution as proof of his holiness. But eventually, he was cornered. Accounts differ on the details. Some say he was seized in a rural shrine, others that he was betrayed by a disillusioned member, but all agree that his arrest was treated with extreme secrecy. The state could not allow the spectacle of a trial to reveal too much. What he said under interrogation remains only in fragments, but reports suggest he never denied his role. Instead, he preached. He told his captors that they could not understand, that they were blinded by false morality, that his cult represented the true essence of purity. To him, their horror was proof of their corruption. The investigation uncovered not just acts of cannibalism but an entire worldview built around it. Police found scrolls filled with the founder's writings, sermons that twisted folklore into doctrine, prayers that blessed flesh as divine, symbols carved into wood and bone marking allegiance. These artifacts painted a picture not of random madness but of a carefully constructed religion, one designed to bind its members through fear, ritual, and blood. The Japanese public, however, never saw the full extent of these discoveries. Much of what the police uncovered was suppressed, filed away in archives that would remain sealed for decades. Officially, the story was minimized, a dangerous sect dismantled, a handful of criminals punished. Unofficially, the evidence was too scandalous to reveal. To admit that such a cult had thrived in Japan would have undermined the state's narrative of purity and unity. The horrors were buried not only in shallow graves but in silence. Yet even the fragments that leaked out shook those who heard them. Journalists spoke of strange rites and forbidden feasts. Families whispered of missing loved ones who may have met such a fate. And within the police force itself, investigators carried scars. Some never forgot the smell of the ritual houses, the sight of flesh preserved in jars, the sound of cult members calmly describing acts too grotesque to imagine. The case had revealed not only the depths of human depravity but the terrifying power of belief. By the end of the investigation, dozens of members had been arrested. Some confessed freely, others maintained silence, but all carried the same stain. The founder remained the central figure, his charisma unbroken even in chains. Evidence had been gathered, testimonies recorded, rituals documented. The cult was no longer rumor. It was fact, a truth so horrifying that even the state tried to erase it. The raids and interrogations had brought the cult into the light. But exposure was only the beginning. What came next, the trials, the verdicts, the suppression of records, would decide whether the story of the cult would be remembered or buried. For now, the investigation had stripped away the shadows, revealing the blood beneath. And once seen, it could never be unseen. When the raids concluded and the cult's members sat in custody, the next step seemed inevitable, a trial. In most societies, such proceedings would have been a public spectacle, an opportunity to condemn the guilty, to parade evidence, and to reassure the people that justice had been served. But in Japan of 1933, the cult's case was not treated as a scandal to be exposed. It was treated as a shame to be erased. The trials that followed were less about uncovering truth than about containing it. The state faced a dilemma. On one hand, the evidence was undeniable. Bones, jars of flesh, and confessions had piled up into a grotesque archive of horror. On the other hand, to reveal too much would be to admit that such abominations had flourished within Japan's borders. At a time when the empire sought to project unity, strength, and purity to both its citizens and the outside world, the very existence of a cannibal cult posed a threat to the nation's carefully curated image. The answer, for officials, was clear. The truth had to be managed, controlled, and ultimately silenced. The trial itself was conducted under extraordinary secrecy. Only fragments of the proceedings survive, buried in court records and suppressed press reports. What is known is that the founder was charged alongside a number of his closest followers. The charges included murder, desecration of bodies, and criminal conspiracy. Yet even these accusations were carefully framed. The word cannibalism rarely appeared in official documents. Instead, the language was sanitized: obscene acts, ritual crimes, illegal gatherings. The most horrifying details were erased from the record, not because they were false, but because they were too shameful to acknowledge. Witnesses were brought in to testify. Survivors who had fled the cult described rituals in hushed tones, their voices trembling as they recounted the feasts, the sacrifices, the chanting. Police investigators presented evidence: blood-stained bowls, preserved flesh, bones with marks of deliberate cutting. Yet much of this evidence was restricted, shown only to judges and select officials. The public never saw it, never heard the testimonies in full. Instead, newspapers printed vague summaries, describing the sect as degenerate or insane, but avoiding the details that might spread panic. The founder himself was unrepentant. In the fragments of testimony that survive, he did not deny his teachings. Instead, he framed them as misunderstood. He claimed his rituals were acts of purification, that his followers were volunteers, that their consumption of flesh was symbolic communion elevated into reality. To the court, he argued not as a criminal but as a prophet, insisting that he was persecuted for revealing truths the world was too weak to accept. His calmness unsettled even his captors. To the end, he projected charisma, refusing to break under interrogation or trial. The verdicts were severe but not spectacular. The founder received a sentence of life imprisonment, though some accounts suggest he may have been executed quietly to prevent martyrdom. His inner circle received long prison terms, while lower-ranking members were given lighter sentences or released after short detentions. The official reasoning was that many had been manipulated, coerced, or too terrified to resist. But the real reason was simpler. The state wanted the story to disappear, and mass trials would only keep it alive. Suppression extended beyond the courtroom. Newspapers that had once dared to print rumors of the cult were silenced. Editors were warned not to inflame the story. Journalists who pursued the case found themselves reassigned, their articles cut before publication. Even the families of victims were pressured into silence. Some were told their loved ones had simply died in accidents. Others were offered quiet compensation to abandon their questions. Grief was swallowed by shame, and silence became the rule. The state's strategy worked. Within months, the story of the cult faded from public discourse. Officially, it had been handled, criminals punished, danger removed, order restored. Unofficially, the details were buried in archives, classified under layers of bureaucracy where few would ever look. The people were left with fragments, whispers, and half-remembered articles. The full truth dissolved into rumor, becoming part of the undercurrent of urban legends that haunted Tokyo's alleys and rural villages for decades to come. This silence, however, carried its own horrors. Without full exposure, the cult was never truly exorcised from memory. Survivors lived with their trauma in isolation, unable to speak of what they had seen. Families never received closure, left instead with unanswered questions and the gnawing suspicion that the truth was far worse than they had been told. Even investigators carried scars, forbidden from discussing the full extent of what they had uncovered. The cover-up did not erase the cult, it only ensured that its legacy would fester in secrecy. Why did the state choose silence over exposure? Part of the answer lies in Japan's political climate. In 1933, militarism was on the rise, and the government was eager to present itself as strong, unified, and morally superior. A cannibal cult undermined that image. It suggested weakness, corruption, and depravity within the empire's borders. Admitting its existence risked emboldening critics abroad and unsettling citizens at home. The cult was not simply a criminal aberration, it was a threat to national pride. And pride, in that era, was worth more than truth. Another reason was fear. The cult's beliefs, though grotesque, echoed themes already present in nationalist rhetoric: purity, sacrifice, the sanctity of the body. To admit the cult's existence too openly risked exposing uncomfortable parallels between fringe fanaticism and state ideology. By burying the story, officials hoped to sever that link before it could be made. Silence became not just a shield against shame, but a defense against dangerous reflection. And so the trial ended quietly. Records were sealed. Journalists were silenced. Families mourned in private. The founder disappeared into prison or execution, his exact fate uncertain, his name fading from official history. His followers were scattered, some broken, some still loyal, their bonds severed but not forgotten. And the cult itself was consigned to silence, remembered only in fragments, in whispers, in shadows. But silence is not the same as absence. Though the state succeeded in burying the scandal, it could not erase the memory entirely. The rumors persisted, passed from one generation to the next. Children were warned not to stray at night, told stories of cultists who would eat the disobedient. Scholars uncovered hints in archives, piecing together what little was left. And beneath it all lingered the truth that the state had tried so hard to erase. In 1933, Japan had faced not just hunger, not just poverty, but a faith so dark it turned flesh into sacrament and sacrifice into salvation. The immediate aftermath of the trial was silence. Officials congratulated themselves on having neutralized the threat, and the newspapers dutifully shifted their headlines back to stories of national strength and imperial ambition. For most citizens, the cult seemed to vanish, as though it had never existed. But silence does not erase. It lingers, it festers, it transforms into whispers that survive where documents are locked away. The cult may have been dismantled, but its shadow did not disappear. Instead, it became part of the darker undercurrent of Japan's history, a story told in fragments, hidden in archives, and echoed in other horrors yet to come. The legacy of the cult was not measured in monuments or records but in fear. In rural villages, mothers told children not to wander at night, warning them of those who eat the lost. In the alleys of Tokyo, beggars spoke of sects that still gathered in secret, carrying forward rituals hidden from the eyes of the law. Whether these rumors describe surviving fragments of the original cult or new groups inspired by its legend is impossible to know. But the fact that such tales persisted long after the state declared the matter closed shows how deeply the horror had carved itself into the collective imagination. The Japanese state, in its effort to suppress the scandal, unintentionally gave the cult story a more haunting afterlife. By refusing to acknowledge the full truth, officials left behind a vacuum filled with speculation. People imagined details darker than reality, and in many cases, their imagination was not far from the truth. This silence created a paradox. The more the government buried the cult, the more its memory slipped into folklore, where it became untouchable, irreducible, and immortal. Scholars who later attempted to piece together the cult's history found disturbing parallels with Japan's wartime atrocities. Less than a decade after the cult was dismantled, Unit 731 would conduct experiments on live human beings in Manchuria, vivisections, biological weapon testing, and deliberate infection of prisoners. The rhetoric that justified such acts was disturbingly similar. The idea that the body was a vessel, that suffering could be transformed into knowledge or purity, that individuals could be sacrificed for a greater cause. The cannibal cult of 1933 was not an isolated aberration. It was a mirror, reflecting the capacity of belief and ideology to sanctify the unthinkable. The cult also exposed the fragility of morality under extreme conditions. In times of famine, poverty, and despair, the boundaries that protect us from horror grow thin. The founders' teachings thrived because they offered meaning in suffering, purity in corruption, and community in isolation. His followers did not believe they were committing evil, they believed they were embracing truth. This legacy forces us to confront an unsettling question. Under the right circumstances, how easily could ordinary people be led into atrocity? In the decades after the war, Japan struggled with its own memory. Many aspects of its darkest history, Unit 731, forced labor, massacres, were ignored or denied in the name of national rebuilding. The cult fit into this pattern perfectly. It was too shameful, too grotesque, too destabilizing to fit into the narrative of progress and modernity. And so it remained hidden, its legacy carried only in hushed academic circles, obscure journals, and the private trauma of families who lost loved ones to its rituals. Yet the silence also made the cult strangely resilient. Unlike other historical atrocities that are documented, dissected, and debated, the cannibal cult survives as an unresolved mystery. The fragments we have, police files, testimonies, suppressed articles, are enough to prove it existed, but not enough to explain it fully. The gaps in knowledge become breeding grounds for fear and fascination. This ambiguity ensures that the cult's story continues to haunt. In modern times, researchers who rediscovered traces of the case noted its disturbing relevance. Across the world, cults have risen and fallen, some demanding loyalty, others demanding death. The Japanese cult of 1933 was not unique in its structure, but it was unique in its devotion to cannibalism as a sacred act. It demonstrated how far belief can go when unchallenged, how hunger and ideology can combine to twist the human mind. In this sense, its legacy is not confined to Japan. It is a warning to all societies. There is another dimension to the cult's legacy, the fascination it provokes. Human beings are drawn to stories of taboo, of those who cross forbidden lines. The very act of cannibalism repels and fascinates in equal measure. By burying the cult's history, Japan ensured that it would not be remembered as a case study but as a legend. And legends, unlike documents, do not fade with time. They grow. They spread. They take on new forms in every retelling. The cult that worshipped cannibalism became less a historical event than a myth of horror, passed down like a ghost story told to remind people of what lurks in the dark corners of belief. But beyond legend, its true legacy lies in what it reveals about the human condition. It shows how fragile morality can be when tested by hunger and fear. It shows how charisma can twist faith into fanaticism. It shows how silence, enforced by the state, does not erase trauma but preserves it in shadows. And it shows how the darkest hungers, whether for food, power, or purity, can consume not only flesh but humanity itself. By the late 20th century, when fragments of the cult's history resurfaced in academic research and obscure publications, readers were horrified but also unsurprised. Japan's darker chapters had already been exposed through wartime revelations, and the cult story fit into a larger pattern, a society that, under pressure, produced acts that defied comprehension. The cannibal cult of 1933 was not an anomaly but a symptom, a reflection of what happens when suffering collides with belief and is left unchecked by oversight or compassion. Today, its memory lingers not in official history books but in shadows, in rumors, in whispered warnings, in the fascination of those who study the macabre. Its legacy is not closure but unease, not lessons neatly packaged but questions left unresolved. What the cult left behind was not just bones in the earth or jars in forgotten cellars, but a haunting truth, that within any society, beneath the surface of order and civility, lies the potential for belief so dark it can turn even the most sacred into the most profane. The cult of 1933 may seem unique in its grotesque theology, but it was not the first time humans turned to flesh as food, nor the first to cloak cannibalism in ritual. To place its story in context, we must examine the long, unsettling history of human flesh as both survival and sacrament. Across cultures, across centuries, the forbidden act has returned again and again, each time shaped by desperation, belief, or power. What makes the Japanese cult stand apart is not that it ate flesh, but that it sanctified it, turning horror into holiness in a way few others dared. One of the most infamous Western examples comes from the mid-19th century, the Donner Party. In 1846, a group of American pioneers became trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains during a brutal winter. Cut off from supplies, they faced starvation. Their diaries tell of eating leather, bark, even boiled hides before finally turning to the bodies of those who had died. For them, cannibalism was not ideology but survival, a last resort against death. Their story horrified contemporaries, but the circumstances made it understandable, if not forgivable. Unlike the Japanese cult, the Donners did not sanctify the act, they endured it. That distinction is crucial. In South America, another survival story shook the world in 1972, when a Uruguayan rugby team's plane crashed in the Andes. Stranded for weeks with no food, the survivors made the unimaginable choice to consume the flesh of their dead teammates. When rescued, they explained that it was either cannibalism or death. Again, the world reacted with shock, but also sympathy. Here too, cannibalism was a desperate response to starvation, not a doctrine, not a ritual, but survival written in blood. Yet not all cases were born of necessity. History is filled with examples of ritual cannibalism, where eating flesh was not survival but ceremony. Among the Aztecs, captured warriors were sometimes sacrificed and their bodies consumed as offerings to the gods. In some tribes of Papua New Guinea, the practice of endocannibalism, consuming deceased relatives, was seen as a way to honor the dead and absorb their strength. In both cases, the act was framed not as grotesque but as sacred, a communion between the living and the divine. Here we find echoes of the Japanese cult's beliefs, though the contexts differ. Where indigenous tribes treated the practice as reverence, the cult twisted it into a theology of purity and power. Europe too has its shadows. In the 16th and 17th centuries, a practice known as medicinal cannibalism spread across the continent. Apothecaries sold powders made from human bone, flesh, and even blood, claiming they could cure ailments from headaches to epilepsy. The most prized substance was mumia, derived from mummified remains brought from Egypt. In this sense, cannibalism was not survival or ritual but medicine, justified by science rather than faith. The parallels to the cult's claims that flesh could heal weakness are striking. Both reflect the same unsettling idea, that consuming human remains could bring strength, vitality, or health. Even within Japan, whispers of cannibalism predated the cult. Famines in earlier centuries forced villagers into desperate measures, stories of which lingered in folklore. In some tales, starving peasants were said to draw lots to decide who would die for the others. These stories, never meant as doctrine, provided the founder of the 1933 cult with raw material for his sermons. By reframing folklore as sacred truth, he bridged the gap between desperation and devotion, transforming survival horror into ritual theology. The most chilling comparison, however, lies not in survival or medicine but in ideology. During World War II, atrocities committed by Japan's military included documented cases of cannibalism. Prisoners of war in the Pacific reported being mutilated and consumed by soldiers. Historians argue these acts were less about hunger than domination, an assertion of power, humiliation, and ultimate control over the enemy. Flesh was not eaten for sustenance but as a statement. In this, the echo of the 1933 cult is clear. The consumption of flesh as a demonstration of belief, power, or purity, not as necessity. Both reveal how cannibalism can be transformed into ideology, weaponized to serve causes beyond survival. The difference, and what makes the cult so uniquely terrifying, lies in its structure. Survival cannibalism is episodic, ending when food is found. Ritual cannibalism in indigenous cultures was structured but bounded within traditions. The Japanese military's wartime acts were atrocities committed under chaos and cruelty. But the cult of 1933 institutionalized cannibalism as faith. It built hierarchy, doctrine, and ritual around the act, turning it into the very core of identity. Members did not consume flesh occasionally. They consumed it as sacrament, as prayer, as obligation. That level of institutionalization sets the cult apart. Looking across these comparisons, a grim pattern emerges. Cannibalism returns wherever humanity is pressed to its limits, whether by hunger, belief, or power. It is a universal taboo, yet one that proves fragile when survival is threatened or when ideology demands it. What the Japanese cult demonstrated was how easily the taboo can be reframed. By invoking folklore, twisting religious language, and exploiting desperation, the founder turned the unthinkable into the inevitable. This broader history also shows why the cult story resonates far beyond Japan. The Donner Party, the Andes survivors, the Aztecs, the apothecaries of Europe, all reflect different facets of the same disturbing truth. Human flesh has always tempted humanity at its edges. The cult of 1933 was not born in isolation. It was part of this longer lineage, but it distinguished itself by sanctifying the act in a way few others have. For viewers today, these comparisons serve as both context and warning. They remind us that cannibalism is not simply a grotesque anomaly, but a recurring possibility when society collapses or belief overwhelms reason. The Japanese cult stands out because it was neither famine nor accident nor ancient tradition. It was modern, deliberate, constructed in an era of rising nationalism and secrecy. It shows us not the desperation of survival but the danger of belief when it crosses into fanaticism. By setting the cult against the backdrop of history, we see its place not as an isolated horror but as part of a recurring human pattern. And in that recognition lies the most unsettling lesson, that the line between civilization and cannibalism is thinner than we would like to believe, and that under the right conditions, even the unthinkable can be rationalized as holy. In the end, the story of the 1933 Japanese cannibal cult is not simply about rituals, victims, or even belief. It is about hunger, the darkest hunger of all. Not just the hunger of the body, but the hunger of the soul. A hunger for purity, for belonging, for transcendence. A hunger that, when twisted by desperation and ideology, consumes not only flesh but morality itself. The cult's history is a reminder that beneath the structures of law, religion, and society, there lies a fragile boundary. And once that boundary is crossed, humanity itself can dissolve. When we look back on the cult today, we are tempted to see it as something alien, monstrous, far removed from ordinary life. But the truth is more disturbing. The men and women who joined were not born monsters. They were farmers, students, laborious, the forgotten poor. Their lives were shaped by hunger, poverty, and fear. What drew them to the cult was not evil, but the promise of salvation. The founder offered meaning in their suffering, belonging in their isolation, purity in their shame. In that sense, the cult was not an aberration but an exaggeration of the very forces that shape all human societies: faith, fear, and the need for community. That is what makes their story so chilling. If ordinary people can be convinced to eat flesh in the name of purity, then how strong is the barrier that separates us from the unthinkable? History is filled with moments when morality collapsed under pressure, when survival, ideology, or devotion pushed humans to commit acts they once thought impossible. The cult of 1933 is only one example among many, but it is perhaps the most intimate. It did not occur in the chaos of war or the desperation of shipwreck. It happened in ordinary cities, in quiet villages, in the hidden corners of a society that prided itself on order and tradition. It shows us that horror does not always come from the outside. Sometimes, it grows from within. The state's decision to suppress the cult story ensured that it would not become a scandal, but it also ensured that its lessons would remain hidden. By burying the evidence, by silencing the press, by erasing testimonies, Japan denied itself the chance to confront the reality of what had happened. Instead, the cult slipped into folklore, half believed, half denied, a ghost that haunted the margins of memory. Silence was meant to protect the nation's pride, but it also protected the conditions that allowed such a movement to flourish. Without reckoning, there can be no prevention. Even now, nearly a century later, the cult story remains fragmented. Scholars argue over the details, journalists dig through archives, families whisper of loved ones lost. The full truth may never be known, and perhaps that is fitting. The cult thrived on secrecy, and secrecy still cloaks it. What survives is not clarity but unease, not certainty but questions. And perhaps those questions are more powerful than answers. They force us to confront not only what happened in 1933, but what could happen again. Because the lesson of the cult is not confined to Japan. Across the world, belief continues to drive people into extremes. Cults rise, demanding loyalty, sacrifice, sometimes even death. Ideologies twist morality, convincing followers that evil is holy. Hunger, whether physical, spiritual, or political, still gnaws at societies, and where hunger exists, the potential for horror exists too. The story of the cult is not ancient history. It is a mirror, reflecting back the darkest parts of ourselves. And yet, there is another hunger that lingers after this story, the hunger for understanding. We want to know how it happened, why it happened, how people could do such things. But perhaps the most disturbing truth is that the answer lies not in madness, but in humanity itself. The cult did not reject human instincts, it exploited them. The need for food, the need for community, the need for meaning, these are universal. The founder twisted them into something monstrous, but the roots were always human. That recognition is what makes the cult's story truly terrifying. Imagine sitting in one of those ritual chambers, the air heavy with smoke, the chanting echoing in your ears, hunger burning in your stomach, fear pressing against your chest. Imagine being told that the only way to cleanse yourself, to belong, to survive, was to eat. Would you refuse? Would you resist? Or would you, like so many others, take the step that cannot be undone? These are the questions the cult forces upon us. They strip away the comfort of distance, reminding us that under the right conditions, the unthinkable may not be as far away as we hope. The cult of 1933 is gone, dismantled by raids, silenced by trials, buried by secrecy. But its story endures because it is not only about them, it is about us. About the fragility of morality, the danger of blind faith, the hunger that lies at the core of human existence. It endures as a reminder that horror is not always outside the gates. Sometimes it is born in the places we least expect, in forgotten villages, in quiet families, in the hearts of ordinary people. By the end of this journey, we are left with a chilling truth. The cult that worshipped cannibalism did not see itself as monstrous. It saw itself as holy. Its followers did not believe they were committing evil. They believed they were transcending it. And that is what makes their story so haunting. Because when faith can sanctify even the act of eating flesh, then the boundary between the sacred and the profane collapses. And when that boundary collapses, what remains is not civilization, not morality, but the darkest hunger of all,